Hi, I'm Ron Jackson. Welcome to Neighborhood Bible University. At the church here, I'm a pastor as well as a counselor, and I'm delighted to be a part of your university experience as we look at some verses from the book of Philippians. It can be a little bit confusing, but if we take the time and look carefully, they explain a lot about Paul and a lot about what really goes on in the church sometimes. Let's take a look at our passage today. It's Philippians 1:15 to 17. There you see it on your screen here. And Paul writes these words. He's writing a letter to the Philippian church, who has been very generous with him and kind with him, even sending people to Rome to encourage him while he is in jail. And so he's writing this because they know that some of this has gotten back to them in Philippi, and he's concerned, so he wants to set the record straight. And Paul says here in verse 15, "It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so in loving, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains." Let's take a look at these verses here a little more carefully. It says here in verse 15, "It is true that some people preach Christ out of envy and rivalry." Those aren't the kind of words you want to hear about a preacher or in a church at all. Envy and rivalry are attitudes we don't want to really have. But people were preaching that because when Paul comes to Rome, it obviously stirs up an awful lot of emotion. Paul, the great apostle, Paul, the one who started so many churches and wrote so many letters, and this Paul causes people to get really upset in the church of Rome because they were a big fish. But when Paul arrives, he's the bigger fish. He's a celebrity. He's the one everyone wants to talk to and be with. So I think a lot of these men who were leading their churches, though they be small, basically felt they needed to get louder and more obnoxious because he wanted to make sure they showed themselves to be even better than the Apostle Paul. So they did preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. What was the goodwill they did? They did so in love, of caring for people, and out of the goodwill to make Paul feel encouraged. And so obviously there was a revival going on in Rome. Paul was there. More people were preaching, more people coming out to share the good news, because I'm sure Paul, being changed, emboldened some people. Well, maybe it's not so bad after all. Paul's doing okay, and we'll do okay. We want more to know about Jesus Christ. Paul really saw his chains in this issue here as being a good way to share the gospel. Every 4 hours, a new guard would come along and be attached to Paul. He could share with them the good news, greet the visitors from Philippi that would come to him, have prayer with them, have Timothy right by his side writing this letter and writing other letters. Paul was a very busy man, and even though he was in prison, he was probably more in a private home, under guard. He couldn't go anywhere without that Roman guard with him, but able to greet and continue on and to love the people in Rome and to be in a place he always wanted to be at. He thought he'd have a great opportunity to preach Christ even in the household of Caesar, and he did. Well, these people that were preaching out of envy and rivalry, Paul was saying that they're really preaching Christ out of selfish ambition. They just want to further themselves. They felt they could do better than Paul. Perhaps they even felt, well, if Paul's in prison, he must have really messed up somehow. He's not the kind of man we want leading our church. But Paul was going to preach Christ, and every time he went to a city, often caused riots and difficulty, upsetting people, because he was firm, and they needed to know who Jesus was, and he wanted that laid out clearly here. So these guys doing it out of envy, rivalry, selfish ambition, were not being sincere, hoping that that would stir up trouble for Paul, that he would feel hurt and envious. But not according to Paul, because there were those who preached of goodwill and in love. So Paul says, I'm defending the gospel. I'm telling others about Jesus Christ. I'm correcting the record. Because you see, Paul was arrested for the very fact of teaching others about Jesus Christ. And Paul says, fine, I'll be happy to make my case. And by choosing to say his priorities were that as a Roman citizen, he wanted to be before Caesar, if he went to Rome under chains, everybody who wanted to accuse Paul had to go to Rome also. So that's why Paul was in chains for so long. Everybody that wanted to accuse Paul had to get passage on a boat, get to Rome, and be prepared to go before Caesar himself and say why Paul was such a bad person. So while all this is going on, others were taking advantage. They felt they were more slick, they were more popular, and that Paul was, a troublemaker. They felt they could do a better job. And maybe they could in some ways, but Paul was the one who pushed the boundaries of the church. He founded churches everywhere. And Paul was not a warm and fuzzy guy, but he got the job done. But he did love Christ, he loved the people, he loved the church. And so he knew that others doing it just out of selfish ambition and all that. But Paul says the gospel is being preached. Notice Paul is not trying to correct them for wrong doctrine. This isn't a doctrinal issue, it's a personality issue. Envy, rivalry, selfish ambition. Those are some of the characteristics of these people in this particular verses here. Not the kind of verses that you'd want applied to your own personal pastor, but even if they have some of these issues, it's okay. Christ is being proclaimed. And when you think about it, in my experience in the church, I've met some pastors that really were envying one another, had cheap rivalries with others, and a lot of selfish ambition. I worked at some small churches in the beginning of my ministry, and there was one pastor very prominent at the time. I won't mention his name right now, but very prominent, and I loved his preaching. But I also appreciated the pastor I was working with. But the pastor I was working with always said derogatory and demeaning things about this popular pastor. And I finally said, what's the big deal? He said, well, all that pastor can do is preach little stories. He never really studies the Bible. I felt he was so wrong. And then I realized he was jealous. This big pastor had a very big church and a very popular following. He, although faithful in preaching the gospel, had a small church and apparently was unhappy being in that kind of a situation. I think some of these pastors in Rome felt much the same way. Paul had come, overshadowed them, and they got angry about that. And Paul said, as long as the gospel is preached, that's good enough for me. That should be good enough for us as well. If Christ is preached, whether the pastor is positive or just a good old country pastor in a small church, if Christ is made triumphant, if Christ is preached, that's the most important thing. Ever had an experience where you're asked to do a prayer or a devotion, and when you're just about to do it inside, you felt like you wish you weren't there and you weren't happy about being there? Guess what? That's okay, because you still did that devotional, you still preached Christ. And even though your attitude wasn't the best, if Christ is made known, that's the most important thing. So Paul saw that. We need to see that as well. So thank you for visiting our university here. Hopefully these verses make a little more sense to you along that line. Glad to have been here with you. Take care and God bless.